Vi fortsätter i Östeuropa och det är nog många som har hört talas om det här fallet Sergej Magnitskij. Och nu upp på scen så kommer Anastasia Kirilenko och Johan Berggren från Ordfront, eller hur? Ja, kom upp nu då. Stå inte där och tryck. Nu kommer vi prata om maffia, Putin och korruption och pengatvätt. En massa komplicerade ämnen. Kanske kommer detta också sluta lite positivt. Man kan ju hoppas. Inte, Johan säger det kommer sluta negativt. Pessimistiskt.
Jag vet inte om det finns några bilder. Jag kan kolla. Ja, det kan vara det. Hej. Hörs det? Ja, vad bra. Så, okej. Hej där. Johan Berggren heter jag som sagt. Jag har fått hoppa in för Anna Wigenmark. Hoppas ingen är besviken. Vi ska prata i 40 minuter om... Ja, jag fortsätter kanske nu. Bättre. Vi ska prata om situationen i Ryssland. And this talk will be held in English because we have with us Anastasia Kirilenko and Martin Uggla. And Anastasia is a rather famous investigative reporter. And Martin Uggla is head of the Östgruppen and also a journalist and opinion maker and a human rights expert. And the subject of today is the case of Sergej Magnitskij. And this is a case that is in the center of the Russian, not maybe the Russian corruption or maybe the Russian system. They are more and more the same. And I was going to first ask Anastasia if you could tell us about the case of Sergej Magnitskij. Who is he and what happened to him and what is the case?
Hello. So it's my pleasure to present this case here. I'm independent Russian investigative journalist. Last year, my...
Put the microphone like this? No,
like this?
Beard, yeah, there is.
Wow, okay. So last year, my documentary called Putin and the Mafia was aired at Swedish TV, Channel 4. Probably some of you have seen it. Or probably you can find it in the archives later. One part of it was the Sergej Magnitskij case. Sergej Magnitskij was a Russian lawyer who reported a huge tax refund scam. Basically, 230 millions of US dollars were stolen from Russian budget under the guise of tax refund, and then they were laundered in dozens of different countries, from Switzerland to Baltic countries, in Spain, in France, etc. But instead of prosecuting, investigating the complaints by Sergej Magnitskij, Russian authorities investigated himself. He was put into jail, and 1 year later he died of torture. And this is why it was like a bottom line. We have pictures of torture. Here also pictures were collected by human rights activists. It was very hard, but nevertheless, we have a journal by Sergej Magnitskij, this journal, his relatives showed it to journalists, saying what's happening. And Sergej Magnitskij's chief, the famous businessman Bill Browder, he started a global campaign in order to push Russian authorities to prosecute this case. But the response was the Russian authorities said Bill Browder killed Magnitsky himself. It's not a joke. It's Russian TV propaganda aired this officially. Okay, he died in prison, but somehow, you know, he was killed by his proper chief, and they stole money himself, etc. But finally, due to Panama Papers scandal, so a couple of years ago, we journalists also discovered that a part of stolen money went to Vladimir Putin's personal offshore accounts. Sergej Magnitskij, the cellist and friend of Putin, without any obvious reason. So this is like a perfect example of mafia state. We have other examples, but this one is the most famous.
What one should like, for me, it's you have to underline that this Magnitsky case, it's not a unique case as, oh, the Russian state is working kind of good and here's a bad apple. This is how the Russian state works, and this is a case where it's been able to be improved. And I was going to let you in, Martin, with the question of, this spills over, of course, to the West and to the rest of the world, because Russian money needs to be laundered. Can you speak a bit about that?
Yes, of course it does, and that's in a way it's very interesting, because it also means that there is something that we can do outside Russia in order to change the situation, or to promote the change of the situation. Because as Anastasia was mentioning, there were money flows that went out of the country, and this money has to be laundered somewhere. And we know perfectly well from investigations that part of that money is being laundered in Sweden as well, yes, through Swedish banks. We had this bank scandal with Swedbank not long ago. And then, of course, the challenge is to track this money and to take measures in order to counter these money laundering schemes. And that's... of course, it's a very bad thing that these schemes can work, but on the other hand, it gives us an opportunity also to work against it. And I think we should take that opportunity and do it more actively than we have done so far.
So there is a possibility for the more democratic rights of rule of law countries, nations of the world to increase, in fact, democracy in Russia and other, like Belarus and Ukraine, and by going after the banks, for example, or the companies in our countries that cooperate with laundering the money. And you had a lot of examples, in fact, Anastasia. It's not only Swedbank, but could you like mention some other examples with the corporations and the states and the politicians in the West taking part of this laundering?
For example, there was a case in the United States, a part of money from Magnitsky scheme, so-called, was laundered there. And the US asked Russian state for cooperation, but they never received any cooperation. Also, I contacted the Swiss prosecutor's office. They told me recently that we received a huge amount of documentation from Russia. We are now, somehow studying it, knowing that Magnitsky died 10 years ago. So they're still studying what Russia sent them, and I think it is some bullshit. Because the examples indeed are numerous. The whistleblower, Magnitsky is not the only one death. The whistleblower, an insider who gave documents, proving transactions, his name is Alexander Perpelichny. He died in London without any reason, just age 44. So he was a witness for this Swiss case. I hope they will continue the prosecution, but the success might be limited. And as I said, Magnitsky case is a perfect example of mafia state. Shortly two other examples. 400 of drugs of cocaine, 400 kilos of drugs of cocaine were found in Russian embassy. It happened in Argentina. Official investigation, doesn't answer the question how is it possible in Russian embassy. It's like fiction movie or Netflix story. But among journalist community, we are working on it, and we are able to prove the connection to the Russian state. Or, for example, so in Magnitsky case, it was $230 million. Like ending up on private accounts and slush fund or whatever. And in another case, under the pretext of good investments to Germany, Russians stole 150 million euros from the budget. Or it was like, the help to shipyards, to industry. It was like Merkel shook hands with Prime Minister Medvedev. They did it, and then money disappeared in Luxembourg. 1,000 people in Germany lost their jobs. One person was killed in Moscow. It was, not 30 years ago. All this is recently.
Well, what we talked about before is there's two things the audience should go away knowing, is that the notion of the state and like organized crime, like we could have it here, two different things. They are two opposites fighting each other, and sometimes you get some of the bad guys. That doesn't go for Russia. They are connected, they are grown together. The state is the organized crime, and therefore, like we mentioned, when Western prosecutors need help from Russian authorities, they don't get anything. Have you examples of that, Magnus?
Well,
Martin?
It's exactly as you say that, and this it all dates back to the 90s, where you could see the state on the one hand and organized crime, and they more and more got mixed up and ended up in what I would call institutionalized crime. And that's when you get this result that you turn to the prosecutor for help, but it turns out that this prosecutor is himself involved in the actual crime. And of course you have no opportunity to get the information you want. At the worst case scenario, he will help you to put another person that is not involved in the story. And the Magnitsky case actually is one example of how a whistleblower who found a crime himself in the end turned out to be suspected and to be accused of this very crime. And that's I guess why it is such
it's a nightmarish version of Kafka, where the whistleblower is put in prison and tortured and killed, and then the people in trying to help him to get the truth out are accused of all sorts of things, amongst them being his murders. And Anastasia, we were talking before, you have been reporting on this a long time, and as you say, it goes back to the 90s and to one person that was mayor of St. Petersburg. And could you talk about the roots of this and who was already there then?
Yes. Well, for example, in Stockholm, there is a Japanese retired gangster he served in Swedish prison, etc. Back in the 90s, he was cooperating with Putin's casino, gambling industry. This is just an example. It was an official ukaz or edict by Putin, vice mayor of St. Petersburg, that the city hall was found in casinos, and of course, you know, casinos, it's cooperating with mafia. I think the idea was because the privatization in Russia was very brutal, so the authorities decided to somehow to cooperate with, well, with real gangsters for cases. Then they needed this force, illegal force, to explain to outsiders that they're not welcome. Unfortunately, it is lasting until today. From another anti-mafia trial in Spain, from you know, serious proofs, wiretapes, we can see that one mobster from St. Petersburg, he's like his neighbor with Putin's inner circle, and he was running nominations in Russian government into law enforcement bodies. From Russian authorities, we don't have any answer why it is like this, why they still need those shady people. But if you look at the Magnitsky case or another, you know, strange investments, probably this is an answer to realize this kind of operations.
And of course, all these funds, all these means, all this money is stolen. They are stolen from someone, and it's the Russian people. I mean, Russia have mainly, this is very poor development. People are struggling. The majority of the people are really struggling, and also the infrastructure with hospitals and schools is not being invested in, while the Putin regime wants to give an impression of stability and progress. It's not the truth. And I was going to ask you both, what is the sentiments and reactions about the Russian public? Will they protest? How will they deal with this?
Well, it's not, doesn't come as a surprise for the Russian public that the power structures are corrupted. So the corruption is well known. Perhaps what has happened during the last years, when the country's economy has gone down, it has made people feel this on their own skin and start to connect the problem of corruption with their own welfare. And that, of course, is a very important connection to do, but it also means that it has become easier to mobilize people to protest against the corrupted officials. And that's, I would say, one of the things that the oppositional politician Alexei Navalny has managed to mobilize people against the corruption. Because when the topic is human rights, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of speech, it doesn't get many people out to the streets. But when they're facing a decrease of their pensions or other negative effects on their private economy or on the job situation, then it means a lot to a much more broader part of the population. So that's why corruption has become a more important issue in the last year, I would say, in Russia.
What do you say about this, Anastasia?
Yeah, as you mentioned, especially Russian province is declining. They reduced the number of hospitals, and even according to official statistic, now a half of male population, they don't live until the age of pension. So they will die before a half of men. And this is, it make people upset, but the problem is, of course, the absence of freedom of speech. Officially, according to Reporters Without Borders, Russia is at 149th place as for freedom of speech among African countries. Official Russian TV, it's like brainwash. they, of course, don't report about corruption, and they also try to discourage people to say United States are against us. Of course, news from last week, this is, by the way, about Sweden on Russian main TV show, that a Swedish professor proposes cannibalism, to eat human flesh, and they are really seriously reporting about it. So as I noticed, Donald Trump reported about it on Twitter, that in Sweden there's someone proposing cannibalism, and also Russian TV. So many Russians, they live in poverty, they're confused, also they understand or they rather feel that the system is dangerous and that they can risk until their life if they protest. So the situation is complicated. We have, of course, some protests in Moscow. We had even a Siberian shaman doing like Jesus Christ.
But he was arrested, right?
Yeah, he organized a walk, 8,000 kilometers walk. After he walked 3,000 kilometers, he was arrested because people started to gather around him to exorcise, to oust Putin from the Kremlin. It was the goal, but he was arrested, and that's all.
No, it's there is a lot of tracks I want to take up there. One is, and we could return to that, is the connection with regimes in other countries and politicians in other countries. But just like, I want to just state this again, that the expression, the repression of the free word and free opinion is a very key thing. That when you have a state that is married with the corruption, that is married with organized crime, institutionalized crime, then if you speak out about it, there will come thugs around, or like you mentioned before, Cossacks, and they will like crush your windows or threaten you or beat you. When you call the police will come and arrest you. So it's not an easy situation. And I would like to, both of you, to comment on the dispersal of this system, because instead of fighting this system, in many countries we have seen leaders connecting to Putin and like mimicking this system of corruption from top down. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, well, I wanted to stay away from, for example, Donald Trump's Russian affair, because I'm specialized in corruption and not cyber attacks. But it was discovered that in the 90s, Trump's business, also casinos, gambling, was full of dirty Russian money. Even there's a fiction comedy about Russian mafia, and they thank Donald Trump in the credits. Even officially, 13 Russian mobsters used to live in Trump Tower. Sometimes they paid small fines, Trump organization and Trump's casino. And that's it. I remember Washington Post reported Trump's business is full of Russian dirty money. The scandal that it is legal because we don't have, enough evidence from Russian prosecution with a stamp on the predicate offense. So we have mobsters known to every serious intelligence in Europe and in US who invested in the Rudy Giuliani campaign. We have many serious investigations, but that's it. Now Trump is a president, he has his immunity. So my impression is in the 90s, Putin and his friends, they were collecting slush funds to go up to presidency. And now they are like trying to even use even more corrupt practices to influence politicians in the West with even more money. So this is the threat, of course.
Well, yes, it's definitely worrisome that the trend that we see in some Western countries when they copy, in fact, some of the repressive things that Putin does in Russia. It's a pity in the countries themselves, but it's also bad because it kind of presents Putin as a normal leader in Russia. And that, from that, of course, do suffer all the really normal people from the democracy movement in Russia who wants to have a democratic Russia based on rule of law, for example. So instead, of course, Western countries should be very clear in saying no to the practices of Putin and not to welcome him into this kind of cooperation.
I have to underline, this is not some conspiracy theory. I mean, there are actual lot of money being funneled from Putin and people close to Putin to like the Freedom Party of Austria, Front National of France, also to the Sverigedemokraterna of Sweden and other like these parties that are like very benevolent to Russia. Besides being nationalists, they are also like having Putin as a sponsor and a model. And as we can see then, the law, the fighting of the state corruption of Russia in international cases, trans-border cases, is getting very important also as a fight for democracy. And then this poor Sergej Magnitskij has given name to a new law. Could you talk about the Magnitsky Law, please, Anastasia?
There is a Magnitsky Act or Magnitsky bill, passed in the United States, and every Russian corrupt official or connected to Magnitsky case, it means, for example, a prosecutor who did not prosecute his complaints, or people who did not investigate his death, they are under sanctions of the United States. But now it's even broader. Just people who committed human rights violations, they could be also added to this sanctions list. And this is very sensitive for Russian officials because, surprisingly, regardless the anti-West propaganda, many of them have condos, have real estates in the US, have their children in Europe and also in the US. So this it was a very good goal, a very painful something for Russian authorities.
Yes, I do agree, and I think it's a very good kind of sanctions because it's targeting not the broad layers of the population, but it's targeting the actual perpetrators, the corrupt officials, top officials, and those who are responsible for grave human rights violations. I also think it was very good that this Magnitsky Act, first, it spread to other countries as well, so it's not only a US bill right now, and it also turned global. And that's very important because then it becomes impossible for the Putin regime to treat it as kind of political punishment against Russia. If you manage to keep the standard of this Magnitsky Act and really target those people who can be proven of corruption or serious human rights violation, you could use it as a very effective tool. Yeah. And it's very important from a solidarity point of view because the victims of repression, the victims of these crimes, they can then see that the perpetrators are in some way being punished. And that means a lot in terms of support for them because then their case is being seen and not forgotten.
This is like when law gets international and mixed with politics, if you can say so, that the democracies and the rule of law countries will not accept a rude nation to play over the rule of law. And Anastasia, you have been working with also that the practice of Western prosecutors and Western courts to use not only official proof from Russia, but there is also other methods. You talk about that, please.
Yes, exactly. I regularly participate in also professional talks about corruption, including with prosecutors or retired prosecutors. And I asked directly this question. So we have a Western state which wants to prosecute money laundering. But Russian prosecutor's office does not cooperate to prove the predicate offense. Well, for example, to give a proof that the money was stolen from the budget. What do we do? And a number of prosecutors responded that in that case, it is not impossible not to use, well, that they may use evidence collected by activists, civil society, human rights. If there's a good report, documented reports with convincing evidence, it finally could be presented in court, and probably, you know, some refusal letters or explanations why official proofs did not work.
And this would also strengthen journalists and civil society fighting for more democracy in Russia, because they will be more important in the rule, but it also perhaps make life more dangerous for them, as it already is kind of dangerous to be an investigative reporter in Russia. What do you say, Anastasia? How is the situation for, like, you personally in Russia?
Sometimes, as I said, in Russia, the freedom of speech merely does not exist. My investigative media, for which I'm working the most, is registered in Latvia in order, you know, to protect ourselves from lawsuits, and etc. But even our small publications, it has a huge impact. Well, it depends. Russian TV aired a report on me that I'm an enemy and I'm working for the most irrespectable media. But for us, it's like recognition. And yeah, we know that even law enforcers, they study, of course, the reporting. I mean, even law enforcers in the West. This is encouraging for the journalism, of course.
Well, it is dangerous to not only to be an investigative journalist, but to be a human rights defender or in other ways oppose the system. And especially when it's about corruption about several hundreds of $1 million, of course there are people interested in silencing you, and that's why the Magnitsky Act is so important, because it could work to deter from abuse, from violations, but it's also important to work in other spheres to support the democracy movement, to support the journalists economically, to support them politically, morally, in contacts with in direct contacts with the Russian regime. So we should use all parts of this toolbox in order to promote a positive development in Russia, of course.
Martin, we have a new foreign secretary in Sweden, utrikesminister. What can Sweden do in this respect on our official plane to strengthen the democratic forces in Russia and like try to oppose this spreading of the state corruption?
Well, what we would like to see from Östgruppen is exactly what I was talking about now. We want to see a very clear political support for the democracy movement, which is equal to very clear political criticism towards Kremlin, towards the regime. Every grave human rights violation should be up on the agenda and criticized, and in a very concrete way and in a public way, so that it would be heard by everyone. But the other side of this is to support the democracy movement financially, because there is a need of economical support, and there are brave people, there are journalists, there are human rights defenders that are prepared to take all these risks, but they need support, and they need economical support from the outer world, because it's very difficult to get this financial support from within the country, of course. And what I would like to see from Sweden, for example, is that the support level to the democracy movement were raised. Because in fact, there has been such a support for several years, but today it's even lower than it were 10 or 15 years ago. At the same time as we have seen this negative development in Russia. So in fact, when the system in Russia has gone down and got worsened, so has the Swedish support. And that's, in my view, it's absurd. It should be, of course, the other way.
I am speculating a bit, but it's the same. I mean, the governments of Russia, or for example Hungary, that are illiberal, as we call them, they have targeted a lot of the organizations that receive money from foreign states or foreign organizations as being anti-patriotic and disloyal. So is that a reaction of that? I mean, policies of the states of Russia?
It's definitely a reaction, but then it's also very important to know that such financial support to human rights work, for example, it is legitimate. It is stated in UN resolutions that these organizations, these actors, has the right to receive money for human rights connected work, no matter what the repressive laws in Russia say. Of course, they will suffer risks and they could be put into prison. People are prepared to do that. In the end, they will win in the international court. They already win in the European Court for Human Rights, and they will win in the UN Committee for Human Rights as well. And we should continue to support them, of course, in that effort, and not withdraw the support because we are afraid that they will suffer. As long as there are brave people ready to engage, ready to take these risks, we should not be the one to deceive them.
To conclude, Anastasia, we talked before, and you were not very optimistic about great change in Russia anytime soon, but then we came to the conclusion that Putin is only a human being, and he will eventually die. And what do you see in the longer future for Russia?
This is exactly what I'm thinking about. I also, I'd like to add, as a final remark, that in this Magnitsky case, there was a former KGB general discovered who knows Putin for 30 years. It means from St. Petersburg. So he's involved in this huge crime. This is optimistic in the point of view that if you take a random big crime, it will lead to political power, well, to Putin or to his friends or to his acquaintance. It means that, of course, we have objective problems in Russia, not only Putin, but he became like a clue personality, and he's only a human being. And when he's out, what will happen? There was a comedy fiction movie called Death of Stalin. You know, the parallel is officially everybody loves a good leader, whatever, but all this is fiction because you don't have any freedom of speech, you have political prisoners, refugees, etc. And there's a total panic after Stalin passed away. His children, like were saying, "Oh, wait, but everybody adored our father. What's happening?" So the change will come, I think, anyway, for positive, something positive.
Let's hope for that. And with that, our time is over. And thank you, Anastasia and Martin. And thank you for listening.